Welcome, Sundry readers. I hope you enjoy today's story. Please remember to subscribe. It really helps me out. Happy listening. New Faces, New Friends by Arleta Richardson. Chapter 6, Being Sociable. Since Sarah Jane and I were responsible for slicing the shortcake, we went to the Grange Hall early. We were not the first arrivals, however. Hudson Curtis was hovering about the fringes.
I snubbed him so shamefully yesterday, I'd better at least speak to him tonight,
I said.
I wonder what he's doing here so early and by himself.
I'm sure he'll tell you,
Sarah Jane said, and she disappeared into the hall. I walked over to where Hudson stood, not looking particularly happy.
Hello, Hudson,
I said.
You're early. We're just starting to put things out.
Hello, Mabel. I don't know whether I'll be staying or not, actually. He stopped and just stood there.
That seems to be a habit of his,
I thought, but I went ahead and picked up the conversation.
Is Colleen coming?
Not with me. Actually, Mabel, there's something I have to tell you. At that moment, ladies began to arrive with cake and strawberries, and I had no time to listen.
I'm sorry, Hudson. I'll have to go. I will see you later.
He nodded dejectedly, and I followed the others inside. Most of the community came for the social, and we were kept busy filling plates and collecting money. When we had a moment to breathe, Sarah Jane and I took our dessert outside and sat on the lawn. Elizabeth came over and joined us.
I haven't even had a chance to see who came with whom,
I said.
It's important to know these things.
But be prepared for the unexpected,
Sarah Jane pointed out.
Look who comes this way. What is she doing?
We watched as Colleen and Lorenzo Handy walked in our direction.
She is speaking to Lorenzo in sign language,
Elizabeth said. When she found out that he couldn't hear or speak, she told Becky that she has an uncle who is deaf and the family learned to communicate with him that way. Becky is learning too. Now Lorenzo doesn't have to write everything down.
How wonderful,
I exclaimed.
Think how great it will be for Lorenzo to know what's going on in church and when people are talking together in a group. He reads lips beautifully, but he can't watch everyone at once.
Elizabeth nodded. It's a whole new life for him. I'm going to have to learn too. He is so anxious to talk when he comes into the office.
It wouldn't hurt any of us to learn,
Sarah Jane said.
Lorenzo has been on the edge of things long enough.
I suppose we should join the others,
I said.
After all, I don't want to miss any of the gossip.
Sarah Jane looked uncomfortable.
I'd advise you not to dig around for any gossip, Mabel.
Why? Do you know something I don't know?
Don't be silly,
she replied.
What have I ever kept from you? I just meant that people will repeat anything they hear, and most of it isn't worth listening to. Come on, let's join Len and Thomas.
I forgot all about Hudson,
I said as we walked across the lawn.
I told him I'd see him later. He wanted to tell me something.
He isn't around now,
Sarah Jane said shortly.
It couldn't have been too important.
Colleen came to meet us. I haven't seen either of you since Sunday, she said cheerfully. My work hours don't lend much to visiting time.
When I'm free, you are working. We'd be happy to see you any time of day, Colleen,
I assured her.
Are you having a nice time this evening?
Oh, yes. Everyone is making me feel welcome. Of course, I haven't gotten on the good side of Mrs. Burton yet. And Mrs. Curtis isn't here, so all is well. She looked serious for a moment. Then she said, I say, have you known Hudson Curtis for very long?
About as long as I need to,
Sarah Jane retorted. I looked at her in surprise, but Colleen didn't seem to notice anything strange about the answer. Do you find him rather odd? She continued. I mean to say, I don't know a whole lot about ministers, but he doesn't seem much like your Len. He acts like someone being hunted. He lurks. Do you know what I mean? I knew what she meant. I even knew why he did it, but it seemed a little indelicate to say that Hudson feared for his reputation if he were seen with her. I nodded and said nothing. I know his mother was not charmed with me, Colleen went on. But surely a grown man isn't afraid of his mother, is he?
There's something you need to understand, Colleen, Sarah Jane said. Hudson is not your typical grown man or minister. He is, as the Bible says, the only son of his father and greatly beloved of his mother. I'm afraid he hasn't done a whole lot of thinking on his own. You probably noticed that when he followed his parents home after the party. Has he called on you since then?"
Colleen thought about that for a moment. "I'm not sure how you would describe it. He's around a lot. Sort of hovers, I guess. Wherever I turn, he seems to be there. I never know why. He hasn't asked me to go anyplace with him. It is very strange. You see him a lot, Mabel. What do you think?"
Fortunately, I was able to avoid answering by the approach of Len and Thomas, along with Lorenzo.
I was sure the subject would come up again, but Sarah Jane didn't mention it when we were alone. She was deliberately avoiding conversation that had anything to do with Hudson. On one hand, I was grateful, but on the other hand, I resented anything coming between Sarah Jane and me. Hudson Curtis was certainly not making my life any easier. Sarah Jane did mention one thing about the evening.
Did you notice the expression on Lorenzo's face when he looked at Colleen?
Yes, I'm sure this is the greatest thing anyone has ever done for him. And she really is a sweet girl. It would be nice if they could get together as a couple, wouldn't it?
Mabel, are you starting again? Why can't you just stand by and let things progress naturally?
Well, listen to the pot call the kettle black, I exclaimed. Since when have you just stood by and watched things progress? Anyway, I have no intention of interfering in their business. But I was thinking of asking them to come for supper next week. What do you think?
I think you're incorrigible, and it's a great idea. What can I bring?
Several days went by, and I realized that I hadn't seen Hudson since the evening of the social. I hoped he'd given up and decided to take care of his interests in Greenwood. The evening with Lorenzo and Colleen was enjoyable. We decided to include Jerome and Myra also. Jerome proved to be the usual fascinating storyteller and kept us all enthralled with his tales of the logging camp.
I understood that the cook out there doesn't have a whole lot of patience, Thomas said. He takes care of the food and housekeeping, and woe be to anyone who offers a suggestion as how it could be done better. That's right, Jerome laughed. Old Pete came to breakfast one morning, and whenever anyone said something to him, he'd put his hand behind his ear and say, "Eh?" After he'd done that several times, someone said, "What's the matter with you, Pete? Did you get thumped alongside the head?" "Naw," Pete replied. "The pillows in this here camp is so small I never slept a wink all night. In fact, my pillow up and disappeared in the night." He rapped the side of his head. "I think it's caught in my ear." The men all howled, Jerome continued. Everyone, that is, except the cook. That night, Pete didn't have any pillow at all. Hasn't had one since that I know of. "That's not an easy life out there," Thomas said. "It would certainly pay to have a good sense of humor if you were going to be a logger." I decided that a sense of humor was essential right here at home when we went out to the yard after supper and found Lilac placidly chewing her way through my garden. Len hastened to run her back to the field while I harbored dark thoughts about both of them. Conversation had been going on around me, and when Colleen said, "That would be fun, wouldn't it, Mabel?" I opened my mouth to admit that I hadn't heard what was said. Quickly, Sarah Jane spoke for me. "You don't even have to ask Mabel if she wants to go to a fair. Do you think Len will be able to take time off on Saturday, Mabel? That will be the last day." "Time for what?" Len said as he joined us. "If it's fun, of course I can." So arrangements were made for us to leave for the county seat on Saturday morning. The weather cooperated beautifully, and as we rode happily toward the fairgrounds, I could make myself believe that the things that had been causing uneasiness were not important at all. We were early, but crowds milled around already. The big attraction this year was the Ferris wheel. "This is the first time they've had one here," Jerome told us. "They have only been in use for 2 years. We looked up at the huge wheel to which seats had been attached. It revolved at an unbelievable rate of speed, and I made an immediate decision to enjoy it from the ground. Sarah Jane agreed. "If I want to stand on my head, I'll do it in private," she declared. "Just the wheel goes around, Mrs. Charles," Daniel told her. "The seats are upright all the time. See, they swing back and forth." "I see," Sarah Jane shuddered. I also see how far above the ground they swing. Here, Daniel, I'll pay to sit on a solid seat and watch you swing back and forth in the air."
She dug a dime out of her purse, and Daniel ran off with great delight. His mother elected not to stay and witness any possible disaster, so we began to walk past the booths and sideshows to the tents that held the homemaking displays. The booths held an unbelievable array of things to spend money for. Children were running through the crowd with whirligigs, having a contest to see who could make them go the fastest. The merry-go-round thumped out a monotonous tune.
Does everything in this place spin around in circles?
Sarah Jane wanted to know.
I'd like to be able to look at something that's standing still.
How about this?
Colleen giggled and pointed toward the sideshow featuring the human statue. We stopped to look at the huge poster outside a tent.
"The man is alive,"
the barker proclaimed.
"Yet you will not see him move. You cannot detect his breathing. He will stand in this position for hours at a time. He will not blink his eyes or swallow. For 10 cents you may observe this wonder man. If you detect any sign of life in him, your money will be cheerfully refunded." "Why would I pay a dime to watch that?"
Sarah Jane replied.
"I can see the same thing for free at home every time Thomas concentrates on a project."
Food for every variety was displayed. Hot corn on the cob, taffy, roasted peanuts, popcorn balls, and big donuts sent tempting aromas across our path.
"They will taste good in a few hours,"
I said.
"There's lots to look at first."
We entered the tent that held the handicrafts.
"Look, Sarah Jane,"
I said.
"there's a quilt like the one we worked on the first year I taught in North Branch, remember?"
"How could I forget?" she replied. "That was the year you had 2 men admiring your charms, and you had to make a choice." I was about to tell her that I certainly hadn't made a mistake when my happy mood was shattered by the sight of Hudson Curtis heading straight toward us from the door of the tent. End of chapter 6.